Hi there. Today we're going to talk about a book about Tony Sheridan. It's written by Alan Mann. It's this book, The Teacher, the Tony Sheridan Story by Alan Mann. And Tony Sheridan's story is intertwined with the careers of numerous superstars, and many of whom looked up to him in a great degree. But he never achieved stardom himself. And the reason was really twofold. One was luck, and the other was his rather obtuse personality. And in the introduction to the book, Alan Mann, who grew up with Tony Sheridan in Norwich and was an ideal guy to write the book, which was a series of interviews, question and answers, um, writes about the difficulties he had, and at one stage, Tony Sheridan actually pulls the plug on it, and under threat of legal proceedings if the book comes out as an official autobiography. And um, he continued with the book, and he filled it in by other interviews that Tony Sheridan had given, and he makes it very clear which material is which. So Tony Sheridan was brought up in Norwich, and at school he played violin in the school orchestra. So he was a talented musician. Then he discovered skiffle and took up the guitar and formed a group called the Saints, and was playing local gigs. Um, but then decided that Norwich wasn't really a rock and roll city, and headed down to London for several times, and gravitated to the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in Old Compton Street. Now, the Two Eyes was really, in many ways, the cradle of British rock and roll. You know, people like Tommy Steele were discovered there. So at the Two Eyes, he gradually started getting work, and he backed many of the rock and roll stars at the time. People, he was a member of Vince Eager's backing group, the Playboys. He also worked with other people like Vince Taylor and so on. Went on many tours, and he was actually on the tour, the tragic tour, with Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, where Eddie was killed and Gene Vincent injured. Um, and he has a lot of respect for Eddie Cochran, both as a singer and as a guitarist, and he showed the British musicians, Tony Sheridan included, some tricks of the trade, how to use a different string set on the guitar and so on to get different effects. So he was recruited for the Old Boy show, which was the original rock and roll show, really. That Jack Good, who was quite uh, a prominent figure in the British music or slash television scene before he went to America. And Tony Sheridan was one of the main guys there. But they had to let him go. In his own words, I lost interest, started forgetting my guitar, and making a nuisance of myself. So this was his own mercurial temperament working against him. Another bit of bad luck he had was Cliff Richard's manager came into the Two Eyes looking for Tony Sheridan, and he wanted him to be the guitarist backing Cliff Richard, and he wasn't there. But the management pointed them in the direction of um, Hank, Hank Marvin, and Hank said, "I'll take the job as long as my mate Bruce can have it as well." And Hank Marvin, Bruce Welch then became members of the Drifters, which became the Shadows, which became massive #1 hits and so on. So that was bad luck for Tony. So what he did then was go to Hamburg, and he started playing at the Kaiserkeller. And in a short period of time, the Beatles came over, and he was a big influence on the Beatles. The Beatles have readily admitted this. One of the things that's very, very obvious was Tony Sheridan carried his guitar very high on his chest, and um, particularly John Lennon and lots of the other later Merseybeat groups copied this. When I first started going to the cabin and seeing the Merseybeat groups, that was one of the things I noticed. The guys, that people from the Merseybeats and groups like that, the guitars were high on the chest, and that came from Tony Sheridan. In the book, he gives his opinions on the individual members of the Beatles. He was particularly fond of John and felt very close to John. um, Paul and George all get lots and lots of warm praise. Not so much Pete Best, um, and also Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the bass player at the time. And Tony Sheridan gives him a bit of a roasting, but I don't think it's in the book, but I seem to remember after Stuart left the bass job with the Beatles, he played with Tony for a while. So why Tony Sheridan would have somebody in his band that he didn't rate is a bit of a mystery. Anyway, um, another guy that he praises who wasn't in the Beatles at the time, but was with Rolling Stone and the Hurricanes and was on the Hamburg scene, was Ringo. So much so that a while later, um, Tony Sheridan was over in England, and he drove to Liverpool, knocked on Ringo's door, and recruited him for his backing band at the Top Ten Club. So that's how much he rated Ringo. And so Ringo was over there for a while before he came back to the UK, rejoined the Hurricanes, and then was tapped on the shoulder by the Beatles. So real interesting stuff. And if you're a Beatles fan like I am, it's always great to hear those stories. So the Beatles worked with Tony Sheridan on their second trip to Hamburg at the Top Ten Club. Quite a few pictures there. And also they went into the recording studio with him to back him under the name of the Beat Boys. And I'll put a link to one of the recordings of him singing Georgia Brown, Sweet Georgia Brown. And you hear Tony Sheridan's voice, and it's a terrific performance. I'll also put a link to a YouTube clip of him on the Old Boys Show. Later on, he toured US bases overseas, stuff like that, and never really achieved prominence. He made loads and loads of records, wrote loads and loads of songs, and had an interesting life, but kind of was in the shadows, no pun intended, regarding the limelight. And as I say, some of it's down to his own personality, and I'll kind of sum it up with something that after he died, Spencer Lee did an obituary on the radio, and he was talking about him. And one of the things he said was that they had a concert in memory of John Lennon over in New Brighton, and lots and lots of people were on the bill. And Tony Sheridan was given 8 minutes or 10 minutes, I can't remember what. And he thought he should have had more time. So he goes on stage and spends half of the time moaning about the fact that he hasn't been given more time. So that doesn't really endear you to promoters. And the other thing he would do is he'd have a backing band and he would either play in a different key or he'd play a different song, one they didn't know, one of his own songs, he'd just play it. And of course, they looked like amateurs, as though they'd forgotten the music or whatever, and he'd berate them on stage. So that's the type of guy he was. In NLP terms, he was a polarity responder, which is best summed up by the analogy I use that somebody sees a £10 note on the floor, and as they bend to pick it up, they kick it further down the road. And this is a continuous process. Always trying for something, and then by your own efforts, making it impossible to achieve. Fascinating book. Really recommend it. Um, Written by a guy who liked him a lot and obviously put up with a lot. And Tony Sheridan was a very interesting part of the Beatles story, but definitely worth a book in his own right.